Welcome, everyone, to the Stoic Salon podcast, where we talk about life, love, work, play, the universe, and Stoicism. And today I'm really excited because I get to meet and chat with Jamie Lombardi. Jamie is a teacher of philosophy at Bergen Community College in New Jersey, where she is also implementing a new and very interesting project. It's the state's first Corrupt the Youth program, which is geared toward teaching philosophy to high school students. Jamie also co-hosts the Philosophy Book Club with Massimo Pigliucci, and her writing has appeared in the Philosopher's Magazine and the Institute of Arts and Ideas. And most recently in Aeon, she published a piece called Marcus Aurelius Helped Me Survive Grief and Rebuild My Life. And that's just a stunning piece that I really recommend you go and read on Aeon. On Stoicism, Jamie has this to say when I asked her earlier. She says there's lots of talk about how Stoicism can help you live a good life, but sometimes you can do all the right Stoic things and still lose out. Enduring is no easy task, and Stoicism, however, can be something like a life vest, she suggests, when you're drowning. She calls this Stoicism for an Absurd Life, and actually that's the title of the talk that she'll be giving at the inaugural Women's Conference on Stoicism, Stoic on X Women, Practical Paths to Flourishing, which is taking place on June the 5th. And I'll add a link below to get your tickets. And on that note, I think it's time to start this podcast. Let me introduce to you Jamie Lombardi. Really excited. And hey Jamie, so nice to see you and to meet you. How are you?
I'm all right. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you for being here. I got a lot of questions for you. You've really sparked some interest with a couple of things out there, but I'll get to that in a second. What I want to start with, and it seems to be the question that I've asked everyone so far, and it kind of ties into the theme of the Women's Conference that's coming up and that you'll be speaking at. Paths to flourishing. So I'm really interested in your path to Stoicism and therefore a kind of path towards flourishing, thriving, a good life, doing well. So I kind of want to know that the before and then that point where the meeting happens, like when Stoicism happened, and how was it? Did someone say, hey, read Marcus Aurelius, or how did that happen? And then the afterlife after Stoicism. So yeah, go with that.
Yeah. So my path to Stoicism did not start with flourishing. It actually began with tragedy. I had always been sort of pursuing philosophy. I studied philosophy at Rutgers as an undergraduate, and then life sort of took a detour, and I ended up married with 2 kids and, owned a home and, golden retriever, and my otherwise totally healthy, normal 33-year-old husband suddenly got sick, and it seemed, sort of mild at first. The neurologist that we had first seen was like, oh, this is no big deal, and I expect you to spontaneously go into remission within a couple of years. And he didn't. He died sort of suddenly and tragically, although, perhaps the Stoics would object to me describing a death as tragic because it can't be avoided, but he was 33. So I'm going to go with it was tragic. And I was suddenly widowed. I was 31 years old. I had a 5-year-old, a 1-year-old. And I was, mostly a stay-at-home mom at the time. I would sort of, seasonally work on political campaigns. And I was terrified. I didn't know what to do, how to orient myself. I had thought that I was, on this trajectory in a certain direction, doing a certain thing. And my whole world was very quickly unmoored. And I, before that, I had been emancipated as a minor. So I had like no real family to turn to. My in-laws were sort of consumed with their own grief, and not able to really see me as a person trying to grieve. And so I did what I always do. And I was like, well, there's got to be an answer for this in philosophy somewhere. And so the first thing I had done, the first time I had someone to sit with the kids, is I had gone to a library at Rutgers. It was the Mabel Smith Library on the Douglas campus, which was my favorite place when I was an undergrad, because they tucked the philosophy books away in this like corner of the basement, because like who wants them, I guess. But you could like lock yourself in these like little closets. And so I had gotten it into my head that I was going to, this made total sense to me, like newly widowed, 1 and a 5-year-old. I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I made this trip down to the library at Rutgers because I was going to read the Phaedo and convince myself of like the enduring permanence of the soul. Like that's what I needed. And, I traumatized some poor woman who was working at the library, because in the years since I was an undergrad, they had like remodeled it and it was no longer there. And it was now a media center. And this poor woman walks out of the media center and I'm like in tears. I need the philosophy section. Where did it go? And she, redirects me to the philosophy section. And, I find Plato, but then I also find Marcus Aurelius. And I start leafing through the meditations. And it really gave me something to hold on to, and start to make sense of like, okay, how do I pick up all of these different pieces? How do I continue to get up and keep moving forward when really all I want to do is just scream until I'm able to rip open a big enough hole in the universe to like pull my husband back from the beyond. And that was how it started.
Ooh. Wow. I read your piece in Aeon and just like went, just haven't read such a like stunning piece in a while. That was, yeah.
Thank you. I'm trying to do a book length treatment of that. Or I had started to before the pandemic had sort of broken out, and then the pandemic broke out. And I've been home with the 2 boys, by myself, and there hasn't been a lot of writing getting done. So to everybody, I owe words. If you watch this, I am deeply sorry. And, I'm wrestling with the self-loathing that not writing the words brings up. But then I'm also practicing Stoicism, that, I need to just pay attention to the life that's in front of me right now and do what I can. And that's the excuse I keep telling myself for all of the words I haven't written that I want to still. Yeah.
Wow. How long ago did your husband die? How long has it been since?
It was 7 years in December.
Yeah. Wow. And how was that process coming back from that with this book, with books? How was that?
I don't recommend it.
Okay, good. Thanks. Because so was,
Right. So if you're like, like turning, getting invited to do, philosophy talk sounds like a really cool way to live. Watching this, maybe, but there's got to be a better path than this one. I don't recommend. It's been brutal. And hard. And so, as you know, in talking about doing the panel for StoicCon, the original title, use the title that was on that Aeon piece about how Marcus Aurelius helped me survive my grief and rebuild my life. And in a sense, like I'm still standing, right?
Yeah.
So like I've survived it in the sense that like I continue to persist through time and I'm not dead. But I've always been a bit uncomfortable with it because it's an ongoing process. And it's sort of like, you know, learning how to live with the weight of it and shift it so that it's not oppressive and it's not, you know, pulling you under anymore, but it's always sort of there.
Yeah. I'm thinking of that letter that Seneca wrote to Marcia, and sort of, you know, asking her not to grieve, for she'd been grieving for a really long time. And kind of trying to pull her out of that and bring her back to, Did you find that you took on that role of, you know, consoling, the consolations, like consoling yourself towards, you know, how you mentioned that to bear the grief, to bear it, but for it not to become that oppressive state. Were you also in the role of the consoler as well as the griever? Were you doing both roles? How did it work?
Yeah, I mean, the nature of my life is such that I had to. And so, you know, Albert Camus has a line in his first volumes of notebooks that really summed it up best for me, where he says, the absurdity of the catastrophe does not alter the fact that it exists. And that was able to be grounding for me in a way, because it was like, this is, and excuse me, I'm going to be a bit colorful here. But, you know, like it was fucking awful. You know, and I've got two little babies who, you know, lost out on someone who would have been a tremendous father. And now they're stuck with me, whose answers to life's biggest problems is like, let's read Plato in the library, because that'll surely help us figure it out. You know, they need to, like, they were supposed to have real like adult in charge and to like influence them. And they're stuck with me. And it's overwhelming. And it's really tempting to kind of like just dig your heels and be like, well, this isn't fair. This isn't how it should be. And like, maybe that's true. But it's not going to change anything about what you have to do to get through the day. It's not going to change that, you know, maybe it would have been better, right? Had it been me who died instead of my husband, or if neither one of us had died. But I can't do anything about that. I can only deal with what I have in front of me here. And so Stoicism has been really helpful in compartmentalizing in a way, and saying like, well, I can't do anything. I can't change it. And, you know, one of the big challenges is, and I'm starting to get better at this 7 years out. I was really bad at it at the beginning. But there's a sense in which being happy after such a traumatic event also feels awful. And there was a period of time where the happier I felt in moments after my husband's death, the worse it made me feel. Because it was like, where the hell do I get off, you know, being happy after what had happened? Like, do I just, you know, don the black veil and live in mourning for the rest of my life? And, you know, Stoicism helped me see that, like, I could do that, but it's not going to make them less dead. It's not going to make my children any less without a father. But what it is going to do is, you know, deny me the opportunity to teach my children a chance for resiliency, to keep going. And that, you know, finding something like happiness or something adjacent to it isn't a bad thing to feel guilty about. Which is not to say I fully internalized that and have like completely gotten the lesson. I don't mean to suggest that I have. It's still very much a work in progress. But Stoicism has been, I don't know how I would have done it without it.
When you were reading Marcus Aurelius that day in the library, what happened? Like, was it some little angel? What, I don't know. How did it happen? How did you know that something special was about to enter your life? Or I don't know.
I didn't. It was, you know, I would find it was almost like a pressure valve, like while I was reading it, it didn't, the weight of, or the magnitude of like how my life had just blown up, wasn't so intense, wasn't so acute. I was able to think about other things and, okay, what can I do? How do I make a life for myself and my children that enables them to have, something like the quality of life I thought they were going to have when I made this, very reasonable, rational choice to marry, a good man who would make a good father and, have a normal life. And so when I would find myself, pulled back under, threatened to be pulled back under by the waves of grief, Marcus Aurelius just became like sort of like a Bible, for lack of a better explanation. I kept it on the nightstand and I would just read it and keep reading it and keep reading it. And I became so dependent, almost. It's like a weird word to use, but I became so reliant on it. In fact, one time a friend of mine was going through a difficult circumstances and I had lent them my copy of the Meditations, which is this one. And you could see, and I apologize to like book lovers, I deface every book that I've dearly loved. It's dog-eared and there are notes written throughout all of it.
Which translation is that one? Sorry.
Oh, this is the Gregory Hayes translation. This one is my favorite. Yeah. I swear by this one. Gregory Hayes tweeted at me once and it was the hardest I fangirled in my entire life.
Oh my God. He did?
Yeah. He follows me on Twitter now. It's great.
Wow.
I know.
Because love.
Yeah, it's my favorite. It was the hardest I've ever fangirled in my life. And if Gregory Hayes ever watches this video, which I can't imagine he would, and I'm not sorry,
I'm going to have to.
You should know. You made such a tremendous impact on my life.
I'll have to tag him.
I think he had read my article or something, and then he had followed me on Twitter. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really meaningful because it really made such a difference. So this is the translation that I recommend to everyone. Yeah. But a friend had borrowed it. And while a friend was borrowing it, I had gotten word that my dad, who I'd been estranged from since I was a child, was very ill and it was, potentially life-threatening. And it's one thing to grieve about someone or for someone who was loving and kind to you. Like that's hard. And I don't, not that I'm advertising or advocating anybody do that because it sucks. But grieving for someone who has been awful to you is really surprisingly complicated and in some ways more difficult. And so I got this news that I didn't have Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And so I went right out to Barnes and Noble and I bought another one because like I just needed it to help, orient my thinking to make sense of how I was going to navigate this next chapter of grief and loss with a totally different type of relationship. So the Meditations is sort of an emotional Bible for me.
I hear you on that one. Which, do you have certain passages that you repeatedly go to for certain feelings or certain, responses? Yeah.
So there are two big ones. My absolute favorite is on page 48 of the Gregory Hayes translation. And it's talking about, and I think I referenced this in the Aeon piece. He's talking about not seeing bad things that happen to you as a misfortune at the expense of seeing the ability to endure and prevail as a great good fortune. And I think I probably repeat that to myself more than anything else. At this point in my life, I've had a statistically anomalous number of statistically anomalous things happen to me. And, in an infinite universe, there's got to be somebody, right, who's got that sort of luck. And so I'm it, I guess. And, they're in the moments when, these terrible things are unfolding, I'm human. I'm not a sage and I do cry and I do get upset. And I sometimes drive my car to a dead end street and scream because it's just a lot for one person. But it's always a helpful reminder that, not everybody makes it through these sorts of things. Like while a lot of statistically unlikely things have happened to me, a lot of other people have been taken out by these statistically unlikely things. And so I don't mean to sound callous to the people who don't make it, or that like, oh, if only they were stoic enough, they would have survived, because I don't think that's the right response. But to still be standing after all of it, and, you know, not completely broken, is a victory in some ways. And sometimes, you know, that's enough to hang your hat on at the end of the day, and like say like, okay, I'm going to push again tomorrow.
Yeah. So you, when you sit with Marcus Aurelius, you read them, do you read out loud to yourself, or do you just in silence?
No. So this reminds me of something else that I've discovered recently. I was on Twitter one day, and I think it was like the MIT Neuroscience Lab Twitter feed had popped up in my timeline, and it was talking about a researcher who was studying auditory processing, and they had come across people who didn't have an inner monologue, and he was shocked by this, and he was asking for people like, do you know, who doesn't hear a voice in their head when they're thinking? And I was like, well, that's ridiculous. Nobody hears a voice in their head. Like that's wrong. And so I clicked like, no. And it turned out that like I was the weirdo, and everybody else does have this like sense of like hearing a voice inside their head, which is like completely bonkers to me, that like consciousness is experienced so much differently for the majority of people. But no, it never occurred to me to read out loud, because that's not how I think.
Wow.
Yeah.
But when you read quietly, can you hear it in your head, or
no?
So you're reading, and then it's just
there.
Happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
There. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And yet you memorize quite well, right? Because you just remembered that quote instantly. So are you able then, if you can memorize, are you able then at a time when you need the specific meditation and you don't have your copy in your hand, can you remember it and then put it in your head and hear it? I don't even know where I'm going with this question.
No, so I don't have that ability at all. So like when people say things like, oh, I can hear, you know, like a famous person's voice, like in my head when I imagine them speaking, like I don't have that at all. Like I just thought people were being poetic when they said that. I didn't know. It never occurred to me that they meant that like quasi literally, because it's just so foreign to my experience of thinking that I thought it was like metaphor or, you know, hyperbole. But no, people really say that they have a hearing like experience of their thoughts or pulling up the voices of other people. And I don't have that at all.
Wow. I love that. Do you write for yourself, like journaling, or did you use writing at all to get through the past 7 years?
Yeah, I have. And so I've done a lot of it. A lot of it is embarrassing. And now it's funny, as I publish some things and I get asked to do things like this, I have this sort of like weird consciousness, like, oh my God, I don't want anybody to like read my notebooks the way that like people read Albert Camus. Like, not that I'm like anywhere near that level, but it freaks me out enough that I've written in all of them, like, please burn upon finding if I am dead, like do not read. But yeah, it's been, I filled lots and lots of notebooks with exactly the sort of, or my best approximation of the sort of thinking that, you know, Marcus Aurelius does, and trying to, you know, lay out the logical implications and, you know, articulating, okay, well, this is what I can do. And, you know, whether or not the results turn out the way that I want them to be is separate from whether or not I did my best in trying to bring about a particular outcome. And so, you know, I'm going to be satisfied with the effort I made, even if it, you know, goes up in smoke.
Okay. So are you like kind of, in a way, rewriting the meditations, but as your own inspired? Right. I asked that question because I'm really interested in that process. And I think it was Gregory Hayes, of course, in the introduction to that. I don't know what your introduction says, because I don't have a hard copy. I've got the paperback one.
I've got it right here. I can check.
But he's got this amazing introduction, and he talks about the work as a kind of a literary, the sort of the literary qualities of the work. And what blew me away was that he mentions that Marcus Aurelius does no original philosophical work in the Meditations, right? What he does is he's just re-expressing and rewriting and reformulating the Stoic teachings. And I was thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? I keep talking about this because it just blew my mind here. I think Gregory Hayes really helped me read Marcus Aurelius. I probably would have been more resistant without Gregory Hayes's like gentle, like nudging and pushing towards the text. But it was this idea that the work itself philosophically is not original. But what happens by virtue of Marcus Aurelius just there quietly, privately writing and rewriting and rewriting and reformulating and re-expressing, these are Gregory Hayes' words, he produces this remarkable work, this completely new and original voice in Stoicism, right? And I have this little group online and we do some journaling challenges every now and then. The first few that we did, I called them meditations on meditations, because we were kind of like just rewriting in a way the meditations in our journaling responses. And then I read an article by Donald Robertson who talked about how Fronto, back in Marcus's earlier years, taught him how to write. And Pierre Hadot talks about this. He calls what Marcus Aurelius does this way of kind of really focusing and zooming in on every word. Like every word has to have, like, really strike his psyche loud and clear. I think Hadot calls it rhetorical amplification, so that it's so striking the way you rewrite the teachings that they can be memorable. The more striking the words are for you personally, then the teachings become more memorable. And it's all about kind of memorizing, I guess, so that when you go out into the chaotic world, you've got them at hand, or at least in your memory. So I was just thinking, yeah, is that kind of what you're doing with this writing practice of yours? Or
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good description. A lot of times if I'm struggling with a particular challenge, I'll identify a passage in Marcus Aurelius that sort of helps clarify my own thinking, and then I will sort of apply it to my situation. And am I, making the appropriate connections? Am I, paying attention to the right parts of this? What is it actually that I'm able to do? And what are the parts that, I have to let go of and surrender? And that's been really helpful. One that comes up repeatedly is he's got this passage about beautiful things of any kind being beautiful in themselves, and not, being benefited by praise or harmed by disparagement. And he says, is an emerald any less beautiful because nobody else sees it shine? And it's always something I go back to when there are these interpersonal conflicts, because you can be the best version of you or anything, right? And for reasons that have nothing to do with who you are, other people may just not like that. And it can be really tempting to take that personally, or at least for me, right? And go down sort of a wormhole of like, why aren't I good enough? What do I have to fix about myself? And it's a good reminder that, like, maybe this is just a case where, like, you're an emerald and somebody just doesn't like the color green. And so I found that to be super helpful.
Yeah, I love that. There are so many. I hadn't really noticed that passage before, but yeah, that's lovely. I love that. And this longer sort of book project that you started working on before the pandemic that you were mentioning, do you want to talk about that? Or?
So that is still very much a work in progress. And I'm sort of, I'm writing it in this like very Frankenstein sort of style. And so, the working title of the book is A Grief Endured. And it's, part like memoir-ish, part, philosophical, analysis, application, for better or for worse, part of the reason that I've been able, I think, to keep going after, losing my husband so tragically, is that on the list of, traumatic things that have happened to me, it's probably only number 4 or 5. So, I've got a lot of experience with horrific trauma. And it started, young and early. And so it's a reflection of, how I've come to look at the world in the way that I do, with a willingness to keep going, and to keep trying, despite how, at times brutally I've been knocked down, in the different, philosophies, and books specifically that have kind of helped me through the way. It's kind of, it's like a walking tour of the formative books, as I encountered them and they shaped me.
Wow, a walking tour.
Yeah, that's how I'm thinking of it.
Oh my goodness. What you said about childhood trauma, and I don't really want to go take you there for too long, but I was just curious because I'd spoken to some other people who have had very, very difficult, very hard childhood, and kind of mentioned that they almost intuitively or naturally developed a sense of Stoic values, and so that without recognizing what it was, and then as adults coming to the texts and learning about the Stoics, felt instantly that, oh my God, that's what I've been all along. Did you ever have that relationship with Stoicism, or the teaching? Was it familiar when you finally encountered Marcus Aurelius in that way?
Marcus Aurelius wasn't. I did have that sort of experience reading Plato, of all things. So I had been assigned the Republic in a not philosophy class. I believe it was political science. And at the time I, hadn't really known what philosophy was. And I encountered the Republic and just, his way of like trying to tackle these problems through dialogue. It was like a light went off and I was like, oh my, this is how my brain works. Like, this is what my mind is doing all of the time. And so in a real sense, Plato's Republic became sort of like a gateway drug, because then I gobbled up other philosophy, which enabled me to really utilize the way that my brain seemed naturally inclined to work, to start to make sense of things. And then Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism more broadly helped me to put things in better context. I would say I made marked improvement in terms of like my emotional peace with what's been done to me since encountering Marcus Aurelius than all of the time before that.
I was talking to Sharon LaBelle recently and she asked me a question. What is Stoicism for? Like, for me, she said, like, what is Stoicism for you? I feel like I need to ask you that question now. So for you, Jamie, what is Stoicism for?
Keeping me oriented to the present. My experience is there's been a lot of like heartbreak and horror in my life, and it's been really intense and really difficult, and it can threaten to overtake me. And Stoicism has been a bulwark against that, and has really given me the ability to say, like, I don't live there anymore. That isn't happening to me now, and I don't need to respond as though the fact that happened to me or was done to me says anything about who I really am or how I deserve to be treated. And it doesn't need to affect how I go forward. It can help me identify, the sort of patterns in thinking that can lead you down a primrose path when you've been told, right? Like, this is the neutral, appropriate way of things. And it can help you figure out where that is not right, and help you change course, or help me change course. And so Marcus Aurelius has this line is, fight to be the person philosophy tried to make you.
Yeah.
And that's always really important for me to remember, because it's a way of thinking, okay, who would I have been, or who could I have been, had I been born to loving parents and a safe home? And okay, well, what can I do now that I'm an adult and I'm in charge and I don't have to rely on them for, safety or shelter, so that what's been taken from me doesn't have to take anymore. And so more than anything, Stoicism has been about orienting myself in the present in the hopes of having, some more positive influence over the trajectory I take in the future.
Yeah. Wow. I do like what you say about orientation to the present moment. I feel for me it's kind of similar. Yeah, kind of an invitation to choose to focus what you focus on. Yeah, I like that. Oh, wow. Wow, Jamie. Amazing. Truly amazing. And I like what you say about, and I guess that's why the ritual of the book constantly being on the bedside or within, at hand, because you kind of need that repetition, that going back to it, and that meditation almost with it, with the text, because it's so easy to be pulled towards thoughts or memories or wishes and judgments. So there's this constant need to keep it there. Do you find that, so would you say, would you read a Stoic text or part of a text every day as a way of prayer, like you kind of mentioned? You call it like a Bible. So how?
So not more so when I'm struggling. For me, Stoicism is more for, a bad life than a good life. Stoicism is to kind of like when the hurricane is raging and you're threatened by a tsunami. Stoicism for me is more like the life jacket that keeps your head from going underwater. So the worse life is going, the more I'm reaching into Stoicism, which is not to say, like Stoicism is bad. It's just, you don't use a life jacket when you're safe on the shore. And so, as things are less awful, I don't do it as, religiously, but I've always got it nearby. And I've learned my lesson from the time I lent a copy out, is that I always have 2 copies of Marcus Aurelius with me, and the Gregory Hayes translation, in case should I find, myself in the presence of someone who is in need of Marcus Aurelius. I can hand them a copy of the Meditations without risking not having my copy should something happen and I find myself in need of it while I've lent it out. So I always have 2 now.
That's brilliant. It's funny too. Like, it's really funny, isn't it? I thought you were going to say that you've also got like one in your handbag and one in like little spots around the house, the toilet, the cupboard, glove box in the car.
That is how I handle chapstick, actually.
That's funny. Oh, and since we're laughing now, I want to talk about the absurd, not the ha-ha absurd, but maybe that too, I guess. Your talk just sounds absolutely amazing. For me, Sisyphus and Camus, that's kind of the philosophy that I really fell in love with all the way through my sort of adulthood. And although I'd sort of encountered the Stoics off campus, not on campus, and even lived in Preveza, which is near Nicopolis, which is where Epictetus had his school, sort of never really loved the Stoics, because I think I wanted to, I was more sort of the existentialist vibe. And I actually had a blog called This Absurd Life for like a few years. So the absurd is really interesting. So I'd love you to just go forth and talk about it. And I'm curious because ever since I saw your talk, and I don't know, maybe it's the Google algorithms, but it's all like everywhere, like everything about the absurd now. And I even went to a critique group with my writers group, the critique group. And this girl presented a piece for the first time to the group, and she was new. I hadn't met her before. And she's writing about the absurd and Stoicism. And I'm like, are you serious? Yeah. I'm like, what just happened there? Because I said, Jamie, and then this and that. And it's like, what's going on? And I'm fascinated about the absurd and Stoicism. And this girl's writing a book of meditations. She's got 366 meditations on absurdism and Stoicism. Kind of, she's just trying to find her way around those two concepts. So it's like, what is going on?
Well, that sounds like a book that I would like to read.
I know. I'm like, write it, please. We need it.
Yeah.
So she's on to it.
Oh, great. Because my favorite books are the ones I don't have to write, which currently is all of them.
You're not getting away with it, though. You're not getting away with it. You're going to write this.
No, my luck, I probably won't. Yeah. No, I mean, I probably won't get away with it. So yeah,
good.
I'll have to do it. Although I much prefer to be the reader of books than the writer of books. But it's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
But yeah, Albert Camus, like the Stoics, interestingly, I also never encountered in a college classroom or on campus. These were the sort of philosophy books I picked up to sort of supplement what was my, proper philosophy education. Yeah. And Albert Camus, I found, very randomly. It was I was, preparing to be a professor for the first time. And I was like terrified that I was going to get asked a question about a philosopher that like wasn't covered in any of my schooling that I wouldn't know. And so having gone to, Rutgers and NYU, that meant like I knew nothing about continental philosophy. So I was like, I gotta learn something about it. Yeah. And then Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. And I had this sort of like panicky moment of horror and realized, well, there were people who like fought the Nazis. And so if you could stand up to Nazis, we got to be able to get through Donald Trump, which, led me to the French Resistance and the French intellectuals, Beauvoir, Camus, and Sartre. And there's just something about Camus that like sparked something inside of me. And it has since been, an ongoing and enduring obsession, because as I said, I don't have a medium setting. So I've been teaching myself to read French, and I've now managed to read a couple of Camus essays in French, which was super exciting for me to be able to do and make my way through, some of the passages of his novels in French, which is like really exciting. But there's this element of something like Stoicism in Camus' thought that really ties the different pieces together. Himself having been confronted with tragedy early on and having to, endure the hardships of poverty, and then finding himself suddenly stricken with a life-threatening illness. He really gets at this sense of, life is now. For however long as you get it, and then that's it. So what are you going to do with it? How are you going to use your time? What are you going to focus on? And the sense of like what really matters in the grand scheme of all of this, such that it warrants your commitment and your energy. And that's been helpful. For where I happen to be situated in the world.
Yeah. I've been trying to think. I mean, I know the work of Camus and sort of intimately, and feel that the Stoic mindset is, although I can see the parallels, and I even now sort of see Sisyphus as a kind of a Stoic to a certain extent. I don't know. There's some fundamental difference, and is it that I think that even the Sisyphus character, Camus says we must imagine him happy. The idea of like that's your lot in life. Like you push the boulder up, and then you get to the top, and it's like, yeah, you made it, and then it's like the boulder rolls back down. So you got to keep doing that, and that's what Sisyphus has to do, right? And But that story, I felt it was a tragic story, whereas you don't really get to feel tragedy with a Stoic mindset. Is there anything about tragedy there? Do you have a comment on what is the difference then? Is it tragedy? Is it, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So Camus says, like, to the extent that it's tragic, it's because Sisyphus is conscious. And it's definitely, I don't think Camus is saying, we should imagine Sisyphus happy in the sense that, like, Sisyphus is a model to follow, that, in all of our mundane tasks that we spend the majority of our lives doing, I don't take Camus to mean we should, like, be satisfied with that in the Stoic sense. I don't think that's what he means by it. I take, in the myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus has no alternatives. He can't kill himself, right? Like, he's stuck there. And so I think, Camus says to imagine him happy in the sense that, Sisyphus doesn't have the option of getting out. He can't kill himself. He can't do something else, but he can access scorn. He can find the gods in fault. He can find judgment. And in that space, that's where Sisyphus has his freedom. And that's not an enviable freedom. And it's not the sort of freedom we should hope for ourselves. But even when that's all that you've got, I think the possibility is that, like, how you think about what you're doing can change your experience of how you're doing. Not that, like, oh, all of us are Sisyphus doing these mindless tasks and, just accept that and be happy because this is fine.
Camus read a lot of Marcus Aurelius, didn't he? Do you know if he read the other Stoics as well?
He does, and he makes references to them throughout his notebooks. His both the first and the last notebooks end with direct references to Marcus Aurelius. The first notebooks ends quoting Marcus Aurelius, saying that whatever prevents the work becomes the work itself. Ryan Holiday says it all of the time. The obstacle is the way. That's it. And so he ends his first set of journals with that, and then the third volume of notebooks is him sort of doing what Marcus Aurelius does in the Meditations, where he is implementing the thinking himself. And so, the poor thing, he had just won the Nobel Prize and he's miserable about it. And he's really suffering. He is, though. It's wild. He's like,
was that the year that Kazantzakis, the Greek author, was also nominated and Camus felt bad that Kazantzakis didn't get it? Is this a story? He
definitely did.
He didn't want it.
He did think somebody else deserved it.
I think that's the year that Kazantzakis, he felt that Kazantzakis had ought to have won it for his body of work. And sorry, interrupted you.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so guy wins the Nobel Prize and he's like, oh man, poor me, this is awful. In part because he thought that, it was, him saying that all his best work was behind him, or, he felt like his best work was still ahead of him. But he wins the Nobel Prize and he is, in the pits of depression as this is going on, and he's working himself through these Stoic practices, talking about how, he wants to just recover enough strength so as to be able to work again, to lower his expectations and to be satisfied with what he's able to achieve in these moments. And it's remarkable to see someone, and especially someone that I hold up in such esteem, and has been so influential in my own life, to be reconciling or I'm going to use reconciling because I can't come up with the word that I actually want, with these feelings of inadequacy or, of like Albert Camus never thought his writing was good enough. And so it's, what hope is there for the rest of us? Right?
Exactly.
But so it's really helpful to see, like, okay, well, these thoughts of, inadequacy or of not being good enough, or, of being sort of an alien on a foreign planet, I'm not the first person to feel these things. These are not themselves, terribly unusual feelings. And these aren't feelings that it's not impossible to overcome or learn to live with. Like, it's been done. And so I wouldn't say, that like Camus is putting forth new Stoic philosophy. I would definitely say that Stoicism was one of the things Camus was trying to integrate into his life to deal with the demands of the absurd and what it meant to be a human in a life that couldn't give you any meaning.
And you mentioned writing and how Camus didn't think much of his writing. Do you have a comment on, because I've been thinking a lot about creativity and Stoicism and what Stoicism can say about creativity and writing, etc. Do you have a comment on that?
I wish. I hate almost every sentence that I write. And mostly it's just, eventually if you write enough of them, you get something. And that's really the best that I've got. I'm still in that space where I'm trying to get over my own, like, oh, I wrote 15 words, or, I wrote however many words today and I deleted 99% of them. So I don't quite have the solution for that.
Yeah. But I think that you're just putting words on paper. That's the best we can do, right? Just do the work, basically. Isn't that Yeah. And sometimes, like I was Heidi, I can't remember her last name. I believe she's editing the APA blog now. And she had written something about like just getting 3 sentences out at a time. And eventually, if you get 3 sentences out at a time over a long enough period of time, those 3 sentences add up. And then you've got an essay or a chapter or a whole book. And 3 sentences isn't that hard. Like, you could do 3 sentences a day. And once you're, consistently doing 3 sentences, it becomes easier to be like, oh, I'm going to do that thing that I know that I can do because I've done it 100 times. And, before you know it, some days 3 sentences adds up 30 sentences, and sometimes you delete it all, but it is a good way to make progress. I like that. I hadn't heard of the 3-sentence rule, but I think I'll implement it. I wanted to also ask you, because I was reading your bio, and I find that program that you're implementing, the Corrupt the Youth program.
Yeah, so that's not my program. I'm just doing a chapter of that. That was started by Brianna Toole, I believe, was a philosopher out west.
So a chapter, you mean in New Jersey, you're setting up a little... Yeah. Tell me about that.
So Brianna Toole came up with this program called Corrupt the Youth. And what it does is it seeks to teach low-income high school students philosophy. And so it starts with, I believe they're Title I high schools. And they go and they teach students how to use philosophy to address, the issues that are presenting us in the world, and these sort of moral dilemmas that we need to solve. And where I teach in New Jersey, I do a lot of contemporary moral issues classes. And so I have students reading John Stuart Mill to get at, like, how do we understand free speech and cancel culture, for example. We talked about, defunding or abolishing the police this semester. And these are really controversial issues that people have very strong opinions about, but not always the skills to discuss them with people that they disagree with. And so the purpose of the program at Bergen Community College, where I'm going to be doing it, is to bring students from surrounding high schools in to talk about these sort of ongoing breaking news moral issues that are happening in the world, and what the solutions potentially could be, through the lens and hopefully implementing the skills of philosophical analysis.
Wow, I love that. That's really exciting. Yeah, I can feel it. That sounds really great. That sounds really, really lovely. That sounds great. And you sound like you're going to be a perfect person to corrupt those young people.
Yeah. So when I first got the job, the alarm label that I had set in my phone to wake up in the morning, back when going into work was a thing people did, was corrupt the youth. And it just tickled when your alarm goes off in the morning. It's good if the first thing you do is laugh. That's why, like even, people that I don't like who do like awful things, I change their name in my phone to funny things that make me laugh when the notification comes up. Like the worst person I've ever dated is saved in my phone as Callicles. So
does that person know?
No. But this way, if I get a text from someone who's like morally monstrous, I like laugh immediately. And so, like all of the negative emotions are diffused. So it's exciting to get to do this. In part too, like philosophy has been so helpful for me. Like, I just don't know how I'd still be standing without it. And so it's fun to see the light bulbs go off in students' heads, and to sort of get them really thinking about these things more deeply.
Yeah. I actually worked with a program when I was living in Australia a while back now, with really young kids. So they were like, 6 and 7 and 8, and it was philosophy in schools. And then we did philosophical ethics with them. It was just like the most remarkable, so beautiful. And they were almost just, congenital ethicists. They were just, they just knew. It was lovely. So yeah, I bet you'll really enjoy doing that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. I love that. Tell me, with your children, do you teach them any philosophy or Stoicism? How does that, is there a family kind of ritual as well around it, or are they a bit too young still?
So my children would give you a very different answer than I would. In my third grader, he says doing philosophy to third graders is cruel. And so they're always like, no more philosophy. Because I've, been asking them, questions about thought experiments, or like, how do you know you're not dreaming, from the time they were, I guess too little to be asked those sort of things. So they're not necessarily amused by it, although we're currently up in Maine, and I was looking for my copy of Epictetus. Actually, it's the modern interpretation by Sharon LaBelle. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I brought that. Where is it? Where's my Epictetus? And the little one who's 9, who turns to me and goes, Epictetus, is that where they get the word epic from? and
actually,
it's like
something.
I'm not sure, but I think it's canon now. But yeah, so I'll ask them questions about thought experiments and things. And, the little one especially will say, surprisingly philosophical things. The older one has too. But as soon as, they get a whiff of it, like being philosophy, by virtue of the fact that it's like what mom does, it like can't be cool or interesting anymore. And so, it's done. The best example of this is they were watching the show. It's like Brain Games or something like that. And they loved this show, and they were, watching more of it than they should have been allowed to. And I came down the stairs, and it just so happened that they were setting up the trolley problem. And they were going to be talking about, the different ways that people make moral judgments. And I was like, oh, this is great. This is the trolley problem. Like, I teach this in class sometimes. And without missing a beat, my older son was like, oh, philosophy's stupid. And he just turned the TV off. He was like totally into it up until the moment that like I called it philosophy.
I teach this.
So I have to do it very surreptitiously.
Yeah. I love that. The challenges of a philosophy parent. I was talking with Eve Richards actually, and I asked her who would be the best parent Stoic of all the ancient Stoic philosophers. And she, of course, said Marcus Aurelius. Who would you say would be the best parent?
I would also say Marcus Aurelius.
I know, because we love him. But why?
Yeah. I feel like get to being a person a little bit better than like, say, Seneca does. Like not to knock Seneca. And, you know, if you can live up to that advice, like more power to you. But it's really hard. And I feel like Marcus Aurelius like has that sense that like, you know, being a person is really a difficult thing to do. And the most unreasonable thing you can do is like expect to be really good at it. Like you're gonna mess up and it's gonna be hard. And I feel like there's an understanding and allowance for just, you know, the pitfalls of being a human in Aurelius that Seneca doesn't have as much of, I'll say. You know, he's a little bit stricter, more demanding. He's like bad cop. Marcus Aurelius is good cop.
Yeah, totally. Oh, I love that. I love it. Yeah, that's perfect. Tell me one last thing before I let you go. If you want us to read something, if you were going to recommend something to us, or something to follow you on, like on Twitter or somewhere, where would you point us towards?
So if you can find me on Twitter at YouTheFro, if you are, when you say for something to read, do you just want like a generic sort of book recommendation of like something that resonated? Or?
Yeah, something. I know it's the Gregory Hayes's Marcus Aurelius, but what else? Like I've had some really interesting recommendations actually.
All right. So I'm going to recommend this Blinding Absence of Light. It is not Stoic necessarily, but it is an account of someone who spent 19 years in a Moroccan dungeon after being a low-ranking member of the army who was ordered to participate in what was ultimately a failed coup. And it's this story of how they are able to hold on to like their humanity despite living 19 years in an underground dungeon. And it is somehow harrowing and exquisitely beautiful.
What's that called?
This Blinding Absence of Light. The author is French, and I cannot pronounce his name. I'll also never be able to speak any French out loud because of my inability to pronounce it.
Okay, I'll look it up. I'll Google it.
The title of the book is This Blinding Absence of Light, and it supplanted Oscar Wilde's Picture of Dorian Gray as my favorite book of all time.
Yeah,
it really is. It's harrowing, and there are moments.
Why the?
Well, they're in a dungeon for 19 years, and you know, in Morocco, so it's not being inspected by like the UN. It is not meeting the standards of like the Human Rights Commission. And there's one scene in particular where they bring a prisoner in, and he had sustained some wounds before being brought into the dungeon, which attract the cockroaches. And ultimately, he is eaten to death by the cockroaches who are like attracted to his wounds. And that's just one of,
wow.
And it's this person is like,
oh my goodness.
And then there's this other scene, and this is, when my own darkness sorts of finds its way to me. I think about this a lot there. So they're in this dungeon, and they're separated from each other, and it's dark, and they're only allowed into the outside of the dungeon for burials when, one of their fellow prisoners dies. And at some point, a bird makes its way into the dungeon. They're not sure how. And there's a period of time where the prisoners pass the birds around to one another as like a companionship. And it's the closest thing that they've had to real companionship. They can sort of like talk to each other through like the walled bars, but they can't touch one another. They're separated. And then there's this period where they have this living creature in there with them that they can touch and they can interact with. And these people who are in a dungeon for all of these years and are subject to some of like the worst that human beings can do to each other, ultimately decide that just because they're suffering, it doesn't mean they should inflict the suffering on the bird, even though it's lessening theirs. And they let the bird go. And I just find that to be like so beautiful that even in the depths of a dungeon for 19 years, they were able to find something like light. And so whenever I feel myself sort of attacked by my own demons, I tell them, look for the doves. Where are the doves? And, you know, if someone can find light and love with a dove in a dungeon, certainly I can do so, you know, in New Jersey.
I'm glad you took it there, because I just think this idea of the darkness, living with the darkness, your demons, they're so difficult. And that's part of what, living is hard because of this darkness. So how do you find the light? Is it reading? What is it? How do you do that? How do you pull yourself out of there? How do you look up?
So that is really the challenge, right? I think, you know, my answer is, I think it's different for everybody. And so, you know, I don't want to say like, this is the answer, do this, and like, you'll be fine. And I think, you know, that's where Albert Camus has been really helpful for me, because he's someone who you could tell through reading his works, and especially his journals, lived with this sort of darkness, you know, like even in his loneliest moments, like he always had like his darkness or as a companion. And it's that sense of paying attention to like when you feel something inside of you like resonate, and that feeling of coming alive again, fight to hold on to that. You know, for me, like I'm a sucker for the ocean. And so it's, you know, get myself to the water as often as I can. You know, and it may not be, life may not have all of the things in it that I want it to have. You know, I'm still alone at the end of each day and the beginning of each next day. But it's easier to take when there are things in your life that like do make you happy, do bring you joy. And so, yeah, reading it is one for me. The beach is another. And then I'm, you know, delighted as I teach myself to read a language I had never taken any courses in. And so I like that flip side of the absurd, like find something ridiculous that like delights you because it's ridiculous. And do it. And just do it. If you're going to be taken down by the darkness anyway, like, go out laughing.
Yeah, I love that, Jamie. I love it. Thank you so much. Ooh, I'm going to be thinking about you for a while now. That was really lovely. Thank you so much for popping on and chatting with me. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right, well, thank you so much, and take care.
Awesome.
And keep writing.
You too.